The loud, urgent knock at my door made my heart jump. It wasn't just a casual tap. It was the kind of knock that meant business. Before I could even process what was happening, I looked out the window and saw flashing red and blue lights. My stomach dropped. What in the world was going on? I hadn't done anything illegal, or at least nothing I could remember. But then I saw her, standing tall with her arms crossed, her face twisted into that signature smug expression, was my neighbor Janet. And just like that, I knew exactly what this was about. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm as I opened the door. Two officers stood on my porch, one of them holding a notepad. Behind them, Janet leaned in slightly, her lips pursed like she had just caught me committing the crime of the century. "Sir, we received a report about an abandoned vehicle on this property," the officer said, his tone neutral but clearly tired. I blinked. An abandoned vehicle? What? Janet took that as her cue to speak. "Yes, officer. That car has been sitting in front of his house for days. It's an eyesore, and it's taking up space. We have rules in this neighborhood." I turned my head slowly to look at my car. It was parked neatly right in front of my house. You know, the place I actually own. I let out a short laugh, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice controlled. "That's my car, and it's parked in front of my house." Janet's face twisted in fake concern. "Well, you never move it, and it looks abandoned. It brings down the property value for the rest of us. It needs to go." One of the officers let out a barely concealed sigh. "Sir, do you have proof that the vehicle belongs to you?" I didn't even hesitate. I pulled out my phone, opening my car insurance app, and showed them my registration. The officer gave it a glance, then looked at Janet. "Ma'am, this car is registered to him. It's not abandoned." Janet's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish. But it doesn't matter. The HOA rules say." Before she could even finish that sentence, the second officer, clearly already done with this nonsense, cut her off. "Unless there's an actual violation we should be concerned about, this isn't a matter for the police." Janet let out an exaggerated gasp, like she had just been slapped. "You're just going to let him get away with it?" The first officer turned to me. "Sir, there's nothing illegal here. You're free to go about your day." I nodded, barely able to suppress my smirk as Janet fumed behind them. She stomped her foot like a child. "Fine. I'll take this up with the HOA." As the cops walked away, I stood there watching her, my arms crossed. Janet turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, muttering under her breath. My amusement quickly turned to irritation. I had put up with Janet's antics for months. She loved to police the neighborhood like she was the president of some imaginary HOA crime task force. I had ignored her ridiculous complaints before, but this? Calling the cops over a parked car? That was a new level of petty. I turned back toward my house, ready to brush this whole thing off, but then I noticed something. Just across the street, Janet's beloved SUV was parked halfway into a restricted zone, one clearly marked with no parking signs. A slow grin spread across my face. Janet had just tried to get my car towed, but what would happen if someone, say, very politely reminded the HOA about her own illegal parking habit? My brain kicked into overdrive. I had always been a live and let live kind of guy, but this time? No, this time was different. Janet had brought this on herself. I pulled out my phone again, but this time it wasn't to check my car registration. It was to take pictures. Crystal clear, undeniable evidence of her blatant violation. She had been parking in that restricted zone for weeks, maybe even longer. And if I was remembering correctly, repeated offenses could lead to something much worse than just a simple fine. I zoomed in, capturing every detail. The sign, the placement of her car, the fact that she had absolutely no excuse to be parked there. Then, I pulled up the HOA's complaint submission form. As I typed out my message, I could practically hear Janet's voice in my head, ranting about how rules must be followed, and we need to keep the neighborhood in order. Oh, the irony. The absolute, delicious irony. The best part? I wasn't even lying. I wasn't bending the rules or stretching the truth. I was simply doing what Janet herself loved to do, enforcing the HOA's sacred regulations. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to play it better. I hit submit and leaned back against my porch railing, feeling an unexpected rush of satisfaction. I didn't have to wonder if the HOA would take action. I knew they would. And considering Janet's history of harassing them about every little thing, I had a feeling they wouldn't be too thrilled to discover she was breaking the rules herself. I glanced over at her house. She was still standing in her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at me like she was plotting her next move. I gave her a small, innocent wave. This was just the beginning. The funny thing about people like Janet, they never think the rules apply to them. But when karma comes knocking, it doesn't just tap gently on the door. It knocks like a cop in the middle of the night. And Janet? Oh, she had no idea what was coming. The moment I hit submit on the HOA complaint form, a sense of satisfaction settled in. This wasn't about being petty, no. This was about balance, about making sure the universe righted itself. Janet had gone out of her way to try and make my life difficult over nothing. She had called the police, wasted their time, and embarrassed herself in the process. And now, she was about to learn what it felt like when someone turned the same energy back on her. I walked inside, still grinning, and grabbed a drink from the fridge. I had no idea how long it would take for the HOA to respond, but considering Janet's long-standing relationship with them, I suspected they would act faster than usual. After all, she had practically made a career out of harassing them over minor violations, writing complaint letters, and demanding action. I doubted they would be too sympathetic when they saw undeniable proof that she had been breaking the rules herself. Just as I sat down on the couch, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled up the HOA website and started digging deeper into the parking regulations. I already knew she was in violation, but what I found made me laugh out loud. Not only was Janet illegally parked in a restricted zone, but the HOA had a 3-strike system for repeat offenders. The first offense was a fine. The second offense was a warning plus an increased fine. And the third? Automatic towing, no questions asked. A slow, satisfied grin spread across my face. If Janet had already been warned before, and knowing her, she had definitely received complaints, then she was just one step away from watching her beloved SUV disappear from her driveway. The sheer poetic justice of it all was too perfect. Deciding to add a little more weight to my case, I took a casual stroll around the neighborhood. As expected, I wasn't the only one who had noticed Janet's behavior. A few neighbors saw me snapping pictures of the no parking sign and came over to chat. It didn't take much for them to start venting about her. One neighbor, a retired man named George, chuckled when I told him what happened. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "she's been parking there for months. HOA's been after her about it before, but she always finds some excuse." Another neighbor, a woman named Maria, crossed her arms. "Oh, I've reported her at least twice," she said. "She acts like the rules don't apply to her, but the second anyone else makes a mistake, she loses her mind." This was even better than I expected. If the HOA had already been trying to get her to follow the rules, my complaint wasn't just another drop in the bucket. It was confirmation that she had been actively ignoring them. I thanked my neighbors and headed back home, feeling like I had just won the lottery. If Janet thought she was above the law, she was about to find out how wrong she was. That night, as I sat on my porch enjoying the cool evening air, I heard the distinct sound of Janet's voice carrying across the street. She was on the phone, her tone irritated and full of frustration. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to know she was talking about something serious. And judging by the way she kept throwing glances toward my house, I had a feeling I knew exactly what, or who, she was complaining about. The next morning, I got my answer. A bright orange violation notice was taped to Janet's front door, and an identical one sat on her windshield. The HOA didn't waste time. I watched from my window as she stormed outside, ripped the notice off her car, and read it. Her face went from confused to furious in record time. She crumpled the paper in her hands, muttering to herself before stomping back inside. A few minutes later, she was back outside, her phone pressed to her ear, pacing angrily in her driveway. I could only imagine what she was saying to the poor HOA representative on the other end of the line. As much as I wanted to sit back and enjoy the show, I wasn't done yet. I had an idea, a way to ensure that Janet learned her lesson once and for all. If she had been warned before and ignored it, there was only one thing left to do: make sure she hit that third strike. Later that afternoon, I sent a follow-up email to the HOA. This time, I included timestamps of when Janet had parked in the restricted zone, along with a mention of the previous reports from neighbors. The key to getting real action was persistence, and since Janet had used that strategy against everyone else, it only felt right to use it against her. By evening, I noticed something different. Janet's SUV was still parked illegally, but there was something new on her windshield, another violation notice. This one was red, a final warning. The next morning, the real fun began. A tow truck rolled into the neighborhood, moving slowly as it approached Janet's driveway. I stood by my window, sipping my coffee, waiting for the inevitable explosion. It didn't take long. The second Janet stepped outside and saw what was happening, her scream could have shattered glass. She ran toward the tow truck, arms flailing. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice carrying down the street. The tow truck driver, a man who looked completely unimpressed with her tantrum, simply handed her a clipboard. "Violation of HOA parking regulations, ma'am. This vehicle is being towed." "You can't do that," she snapped. I was just about to move it. This is harassment. I want to speak to the HOA president right now." The driver shrugged. "You can take it up with them, but this order came straight from the HOA office." I nearly choked on my coffee, trying to hold back laughter. Janet was practically vibrating with rage as she stomped toward the HOA office down the street. But it was too late. The truck's winch activated, lifting the front tires of her SUV off the ground. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, watching the spectacle unfold. Some of them exchanged amused glances, while others pretended to be concerned but didn't actually say anything to stop it. After all, Janet had made enough enemies over the years. When she finally returned from the HOA office, she looked furious. She waved her arms wildly, trying to argue with the driver, but it was no use. The SUV was already secured. The last thing I heard before the tow truck pulled away was Janet's shrill voice shouting, "You'll regret this. I'll get my lawyer. This isn't over." But as I watched her car disappear down the street, I couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time in a long time, it finally was over. At least for me. For Janet? Well, her problems were just beginning. Janet's scream echoed through the neighborhood like a siren. The tow truck was already rolling down the street, carrying her precious SUV away, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her face was twisted in a mixture of shock and fury, her hands clenched into fists as she stomped her foot on the pavement like a child throwing a tantrum. Every neighbor within earshot had stopped what they were doing, and a few had even peeked out from their porches to watch the spectacle unfold. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the HOA office, her phone pressed against her ear as she ranted loudly to whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of that call. She was livid, pacing back and forth, pointing wildly at the empty spot where her car used to be. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to know she was trying to demand immediate action. She wanted her car back, she wanted someone to pay, and she wanted revenge. I stood by my window, sipping my coffee, watching with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. This wasn't just karma. This was a masterclass in poetic justice. Janet had spent months making life miserable for everyone else, acting like she was the queen of the neighborhood, policing people's trash bins, mailboxes, and lawn decorations. She had gone out of her way to get my car towed over nothing. But now she was the one left stranded, helpless, watching as the system she loved so much turned against her. Her shouting continued as she stomped back to her house, her hands still gripping her phone in a death hold. I could only imagine the conversation happening on the other end. Was she calling the police? The HOA president? A lawyer? Whoever it was. They weren't telling her what she wanted to hear, because her expression kept shifting from outrage to disbelief to pure frustration. Then, the real fun began. Barely an hour later, a police car pulled up in front of Janet's house. At first, I thought she had actually managed to convince the authorities to intervene. But when two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions told me everything I needed to know. These weren't officers coming to help Janet. These were officers who already knew her, and they were not amused. Janet stormed out of her house before they even had a chance to approach her. She launched into a furious tirade, pointing wildly in the direction the tow truck had gone. Her voice was shrill and loud enough that I didn't have to strain to hear her. "This is illegal," she screeched. "That was my personal vehicle. I was targeted. This is harassment. I want to file a complaint against the HOA, against my neighbors, against whoever is responsible for this." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them let out a sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he had already dealt with Janet one too many times. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but tired, "we already checked with the HOA. Your vehicle was towed because of repeated parking violations. It was a legal tow." Janet's face turned a shade of red I didn't even know was possible. "I never got a warning," she shrieked. The officer raised an eyebrow and pulled out a clipboard. "According to the HOA record, you received multiple warnings, including a final notice just yesterday. And according to our records, this isn't the first time you've been reported for ignoring parking regulations." Janet's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked around as if hoping someone would step in to defend her, but all she found were neighbors who were either watching with barely concealed amusement or pretending not to notice at all. "This is ridiculous," she finally snapped. "You're supposed to protect citizens, not let their property get stolen." The second officer, who had been quiet until now, crossed his arms. "Ma'am, your vehicle wasn't stolen. It was impounded. You can retrieve it by following the proper procedures, including paying the necessary fines." Janet let out a strangled noise that was somewhere between a gasp and a growl. "I'm not paying a dime. I'll sue. I'll. She never finished that sentence, because at that moment, the HOA president herself stepped out of a nearby house and walked straight toward Janet with an expression that could only be described as completely fed up. "Janet," the HOA president said sharply, cutting through her rant. "Enough." Janet spun around, looking utterly betrayed. "You're supposed to be on my side. I've been reporting violations for months. I've been keeping this neighborhood in order, and now you're letting them do this to me." The HOA president folded her arms. "No, Janet. We're enforcing the same rules you've been trying to enforce on everyone else. And frankly, we're tired of your complaints. You've been reported by multiple residents for harassment. You've been ignoring your own violations while demanding punishment for others. And now, after repeated warnings, your car was towed. That's the process. It's done." Janet's face contorted into something almost unrecognizable. She looked like she wanted to scream, but no words were coming out. The entire street had fallen into a hushed silence, everyone waiting to see what she would do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a sharp huff and turned toward her house. "Fine," she snapped. "I don't need any of you. You'll regret this." She stomped up her driveway, slammed her front door shut so hard the windows rattled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood was peaceful. The officers exchanged glances, then turned to the HOA president. "That should be the end of it," one of them said. The HOA president nodded. "It better be." The officers walked back to their car and drove off. The crowd of neighbors slowly started to disperse, but not before I caught a few whispered conversations and quiet laughter. The air felt lighter, like the entire block had just collectively let out a sigh of relief. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Janet had spent so much time making life difficult for everyone, thinking she was above the rules, but in the end, those same rules had caught up to her. Later that evening, as I sat on my porch enjoying the newfound peace, I saw a few neighbors gathering outside, chatting and laughing. Someone brought out a cooler, and before long, a little impromptu block party had started. For the first time in months, people actually seemed happy to be outside, free from Janet's constant watchful eye. Someone even joked about renaming the street Janet Free Lane. I didn't join in right away. I just sat back, watching, listening, and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once, justice had truly been served. As the sun set and the laughter carried through the air, I took one last look at Janet's dark, silent house. She was still inside, licking her wounds, probably plotting her next move. But this time, she had no one left to back her up. For now, at least, the battle was over. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like I had truly won. The morning after Janet's spectacular meltdown was eerily quiet. The street, once filled with her constant presence and unsolicited complaints, felt strangely peaceful. No aggressive door slamming, no barking orders to neighbors about their trash cans, and most importantly, no sign of her illegally parked SUV. The absence of her usual chaos made the neighborhood feel lighter, almost as if everyone had collectively exhaled a breath they didn't know they had been holding. I sipped my coffee on the porch, expecting Janet to make a dramatic return, maybe even bring in some kind of legal threat or yet another police visit. But her house remained still, curtains drawn, no sign of movement. It was odd, but I wasn't about to complain. A Janet-free day was a good day. Midway through my morning routine, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the HOA. I raised an eyebrow as I opened it. The subject line read, "Further action regarding ongoing violations, resident Janet last name." I clicked it open, already intrigued. The email outlined Janet's history of violations, not just the recent parking fiasco, but an entire list of infractions that had been piling up over time. Apparently, the HOA had been keeping an extensive record of her complaints and violations. The final paragraph caught my attention. Due to her repeated failure to comply with neighborhood regulations, she was facing significant fines, and if she did not resolve them within a given period, legal action regarding her property could be taken. I nearly choked on my coffee. This wasn't just about her car anymore. This was about her entire reign of terror finally catching up to her. Barely an hour later, the front door to Janet's house swung open, and she marched outside with a stack of papers in her hand. Even from across the street, I could see the HOA letter was one of them. She stood in her driveway, eyes darting back and forth as if searching for someone to vent her frustration to. But for once, no one was interested in listening. Neighbors who would normally be out walking their dogs or tending to their lawns suddenly found excuses to go back inside. It was almost comical. It was as if the entire block had collectively decided that today, they weren't going to deal with Janet's nonsense. Realizing she wouldn't find a sympathetic ear, Janet pulled out her phone and started making calls. Her voice, though muffled from my distance, was unmistakably angry. She paced back and forth, waving the HOA notice like it was some kind of legal weapon. The only problem? No one cared. By the afternoon, she was at the HOA office. I didn't even have to follow her to know how that conversation went. She had already tried arguing with them when her car got towed, and that had gotten her nowhere. This time, she was fighting against something bigger than just a single violation. She was up against months, maybe even years, of reports, complaints, and fines that had stacked up without her even realizing it. When she returned, her expression had shifted from pure anger to something closer to panic. She clutched the same papers, but now she walked with less of her usual self-righteousness and more of an anxious energy, as if she had just learned something she didn't want to believe. Curiosity got the better of me. I casually made my way outside, pretending to check my mailbox while keeping an eye on her. She paced in front of her house for a while before finally pulling out a chair and sitting on her porch, staring blankly at the street. She looked lost. It was such a stark contrast to her usual behavior that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Later that evening, whispers spread among the neighbors. Someone had overheard her conversation at the HOA office. Apparently, she owed thousands in unpaid fines. The reason she hadn't been formally forced to pay earlier was because she had always managed to find loopholes, always delaying just long enough to avoid real consequences. But this time, the HOA had enough. They had officially filed a lien on her property. If she didn't pay up, she could actually lose her house. That was when the real cracks in Janet's armor began to show. The next day, she was outside again. But this time, instead of stomping around with her usual misplaced authority, she was making phone calls. Long ones. Some were filled with frustration, others with forced charm as she tried to negotiate something with whoever was on the other end. It didn't take a genius to figure out she was scrambling to come up with the money. A few days passed, and Janet, for the first time since I had moved in, wasn't a public presence. No more unnecessary complaints, no more passive-aggressive comments, no more unnecessary police calls. She was suddenly just a regular neighbor. It was almost bizarre. Then came the final blow. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard. I almost couldn't believe it when I saw it. The woman who had spent so much time enforcing rules on others, who had treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, was being forced to leave because she had failed to follow those same rules herself. Word spread quickly, and while most neighbors pretended not to notice, there was a silent celebration among them. People weren't cruel about it. No one openly mocked her or cheered, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. It was a weight lifted, a long overdue sense of justice finally being served. Janet, of course, didn't go quietly. Over the next few weeks, as she packed up her belongings, she tried one last time to rally some sympathy. She told sob stories to anyone who would listen, claiming the HOA had unfairly targeted her, that the neighbors had turned against her, that she had been wronged. But no one was buying it. Even when moving day finally arrived, she put on a dramatic show, sighing loudly as movers carried out her furniture, shaking her head as if she were the victim of some great injustice. But no one stopped to console her. As the final moving truck pulled away and Janet's car, now recovered from impound, drove off down the street, a strange sense of peace settled over the neighborhood. I stepped outside, stretching as I looked around. The street was quieter, calmer. It was as if the entire block had been freed from an invisible weight. A few neighbors gathered outside, some exchanging knowing glances, others making small talk about anything but Janet. A silent agreement had been reached. No one needed to gloat. The fact that she was gone was enough. As I turned to head back inside, a new car pulled up to Janet's now empty house. A young couple stepped out, smiling as they looked at their soon-to-be home. They seemed friendly, waving at passing neighbors before stepping inside with their realtor. I chuckled to myself, taking one last glance at Janet's now vacant driveway. Poetic justice had never tasted so sweet. The absence of Janet was something that took a while to sink in. For the longest time, she had been a constant presence in the neighborhood, always lurking, always watching, always finding some reason to insert herself into other people's business. But now, she was gone. No more complaints about trash bins, no more passive-aggressive notes left on doors, no more emergency HOA meetings over nonsense. The silence was almost surreal. For the first few days after she left, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, as if everyone was waiting for some final trick, some last-minute return. But the days stretched on, and it became clear that Janet wasn't coming back. It was over. The reign of terror had ended. One afternoon, I took a casual stroll around the block, something that would have been a hassle before, because Janet would have found some way to make it uncomfortable. But this time, it felt different. The air was lighter, the atmosphere more relaxed. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down or avoided small talk were now more open. People actually stopped to chat, to catch up, to share in the relief that had settled over the area. I passed by her old house, now quiet and still. The for sale sign had been replaced with a sold sign, and a few days later, a moving truck pulled up. A young couple, Sam and Emily, stepped out, excited and full of energy, the kind of new homeowners who had no idea what had come before them. They waved at neighbors as they unloaded their belongings, eager to settle in. It was a stark contrast to Janet's constant tension, her never-ending war with the world. These people seemed normal, friendly, the kind of neighbors that didn't see the HOA rule book as a weapon but as an afterthought. That evening, a few of us gathered outside. It wasn't an official block party or anything, but it might as well have been. Someone brought out a cooler, another set up some chairs, and before long, the whole street had a quiet little celebration going. People laughed, reminisced about the nonsense Janet had put them through, and exchanged stories about their own petty run-ins with her. It wasn't mean-spirited, just a collective sigh of relief being let out in the form of shared memories. George, the retired neighbor who had been dealing with Janet for longer than most of us, raised a drink and chuckled. "You know, I don't think I've had a full night of peace in years. I half expect her to show up screaming about noise levels or something." Maria smirked. "I still remember the time she measured the grass on my lawn with a ruler and reported me for being half an inch over regulation height." Another neighbor, Robert, leaned back in his chair. "She tried to find me for leaving my car parked facing the wrong direction in my own driveway. Told me I was setting a bad example." The stories went on, each one more absurd than the last. It was almost funny now, looking back on it. At the time, dealing with Janet had been frustrating, exhausting even, but in hindsight, it was clear just how ridiculous she had been. At some point, the conversation turned to the new neighbors. Everyone was curious but cautiously optimistic. The couple had already made a good impression, greeting everyone with warm smiles, asking about local recommendations, and not once bringing up HOA regulations. It was a refreshing change. Maria grinned. "I think we should welcome them properly, show them that this neighborhood isn't as crazy as it might have seemed when Janet was around." George chuckled. "Agreed. But let's not tell them everything just yet. Let's give them a little time to enjoy the peace before they hear the legend of Janet." As the evening went on, I sat back and watched the neighborhood come alive in a way I hadn't seen before. People who had once avoided each other out of fear of becoming the next target of Janet's wrath were now talking, laughing, sharing stories. It was amazing how one person could affect an entire community and how quickly that community could bounce back once the problem was gone. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab my newspaper and caught sight of the new neighbors unpacking boxes from their car. They spotted me and waved, walking over to introduce themselves. "Hey there, we're Sam and Emily," the man said, extending a hand. "Just moved in yesterday. Wanted to say hi." I shook his hand, smiling. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Glad to have you." Emily looked around, taking in the quiet street. "Everyone here seems really friendly. We were a little nervous moving in since we heard this area had some strong HOA rules." Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new normal. The HOA, now freed from Janet's endless complaints, actually became reasonable. The petty citations disappeared. People felt more comfortable being outside, enjoying their homes without fear of someone reporting them for something ridiculous. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, became a place where people actually wanted to live again. One afternoon, I got an email from the HOA. For a moment, I felt a brief flicker of concern. Old habits die hard. But when I opened it, I almost laughed. It wasn't a complaint or a warning. It was an invitation to a community barbecue and welcome event for the new neighbors. Apparently, the HOA had decided to focus on actually building a sense of community rather than policing it. Imagine that. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the entire block showed up. People brought food, kids ran around playing, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a real community. Even the HOA president, who had once been Janet's unwilling enforcer, was smiling and chatting with people instead of handing out warnings. At some point, Maria nudged me. "So," she said, nodding toward Janet's old house. "Think she ever tries to come back?" I smirked. "If she does, she's in for a surprise. This isn't her neighborhood anymore." Maria grinned, raising her drink. "To a Janet-free future." We clinked our drinks together, watching as the sun set over a peaceful, happy neighborhood. No drama, no complaints, no Janet. And for the first time since moving here, I knew that things were finally, truly right.